In the autumn of 1944, German military commanders gathered at secret headquarters in the Eifel region to plan what Adolf Hitler called his last great gamble in the West. The Führer had ordered a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the same route Germany had used in 1940 to stunning effect when they bypassed French defenses and conquered France in 6 weeks. Hitler believed he could repeat that success, splitting American and British forces, capturing the vital port of Antwerp, and forcing the Western Allies to negotiate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate all resources against the Soviet Union. The plan was ambitious, perhaps desperate, but German commanders reviewing intelligence about American forces in the Ardennes sector felt it might work. The Americans defending that sector, they concluded after studying reports, were soft. The German assessment of American soldiers reflected assumptions that had been building since American forces entered the war. Germans acknowledged that America had enormous industrial capacity and could produce weapons and supplies in quantities Germany couldn't match. But industrial capacity wasn't the same as fighting spirit. German soldiers and commanders believed their years of combat, their hardships endured on the Eastern Front, their experience with sacrifice and suffering had forged them into harder men than Americans could ever be. America was a rich country where people grew up comfortable. American soldiers came from homes with electricity, running water, automobiles, abundant food. They had never known real deprivation. They had never experienced their cities being bombed. Their families back home were safe and comfortable. How could such men, German commanders asked themselves, match soldiers who had fought through Russian winters, who had seen their cities destroyed by bombing, who knew their families faced starvation? German intelligence reports about American units in the Ardennes reinforced these prejudices. The sector was lightly defended, held by inexperienced divisions that were either newly arrived in Europe or were veteran units pulled back for rest and refitting after heavy combat. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, a place where green units could get acclimated to combat conditions and exhausted units could recover before being sent back into heavy fighting. German intelligence correctly identified that American defenses were spread thin, that reserves were limited, and that the Americans didn't expect attack through the Ardennes because the terrain was considered unsuitable for major operations. Everything suggested that a sudden massive attack would overwhelm American forces before they could respond effectively. What German commanders planning the offensive didn't fully appreciate was that American soldiers by late 1944 were no longer the inexperienced troops who had struggled in North Africa. American forces had fought through Normandy, across France, and into Germany itself. They had learned hard lessons about combat, about survival, about what it took to win battles. American soldiers still came from comfortable backgrounds, still received better food and equipment than German troops, still had the support of a home front that wasn't being bombed. But they had proven in battle after battle that they could fight, could take casualties, could accomplish difficult missions. The comfortable background that Germans saw as weakness hadn't prevented American soldiers from showing courage and determination in combat. German assumptions about American softness were about to be tested under the worst possible conditions. The German offensive, codenamed Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, began before dawn on December 16, 1944. Over 200,000 German soldiers, supported by hundreds of tanks and assault guns, attacked along an 80-mile front through the Ardennes forest. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. American forces had not expected a major offensive, had not prepared defenses in depth, and were caught completely off guard. Some American units were overrun in the first hours. Others fought desperate delaying actions as they fell back. German forces advanced rapidly in some sectors, pushing deep into American lines and creating a bulge in the front that would give the battle its popular name. For German commanders watching the offensive develop, initial reports seemed to confirm their assessment. American forces were retreating in disorder. The soft Americans were breaking under pressure just as predicted. But American resistance, while initially disorganized, never collapsed completely. Individual units fought from positions they had not prepared, often surrounded and cut off from support, buying time with their lives for forces behind them to organize defenses. American soldiers who found themselves behind German lines didn't surrender. but formed small groups and continued fighting, disrupting German supply lines and creating chaos in the German rear areas. Artillery units fired until they ran out of ammunition, then destroyed their guns and fought as infantry rather than surrender. The spontaneous courage shown by isolated American units slowed the German advance and prevented the rapid breakthrough that German planning required. The offensive was supposed to reach the Meuse River, over 60 miles from the starting point, within 48 hours. By the time 48 hours had passed, German forces had advanced less than half that distance and were running into increasingly organized American resistance. The weather turned brutally cold as the battle developed. The winter of 1944-45 was one of the coldest in decades. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit at night and rarely rose above 0 during the day. Snow and ice covered everything. The cold was the kind that penetrated clothing, that made metal painful to touch, that turned foxholes into frozen pits where soldiers huddled trying to maintain body heat. American soldiers were not prepared for such conditions. They had been issued standard uniforms suitable for cool weather, but not for the extreme cold that gripped the Ardennes. There were not enough winter coats, not enough insulated boots, not enough heavy gloves. Supply lines had prioritized ammunition and fuel over winter clothing, because no one had expected combat operations in such conditions. American soldiers improvised, cutting up blankets to wrap around their feet, wearing every piece of clothing they possessed in layers, using shelter halves and ponchos as crude wraps against the wind. The cold became as much an enemy as the Germans. Frostbite casualties mounted rapidly, with men losing toes, fingers, and feet to the freezing temperatures. Soldiers learned that they had to keep moving, had to flex their fingers and toes constantly, because immobility meant freezing. Men in foxholes faced a terrible choice: stay low and hidden, but risk freezing to death, or move around to maintain circulation, but risk being shot by German soldiers or hit by artillery. Water froze in canteens. Rations froze solid and couldn't be eaten without thawing, but building fires to heat food would reveal positions to German observers. Weapons froze and had to be constantly maintained to keep functioning. Machine guns had to be fired periodically just to keep the mechanisms from freezing solid. The suffering was intense and constant, and it affected German soldiers as well. But Germans had winter clothing and Americans largely didn't. The German assumption that soft Americans couldn't endure hardship seemed to be validated by the conditions, even if American combat performance wasn't confirming the stereotype. The town of Bastogne became the critical point in the battle. Bastogne was a road hub where 7 major roads met, making it essential for German forces trying to advance west toward the Meuse River. If German armor could push through Bastogne, they could maintain momentum and possibly achieve their operational objectives. If Americans held Bastogne, German forces would be channeled into routes that bypassed the town, slowing their advance and making them vulnerable to counterattack. American commanders recognized Bastogne's importance and rushed reinforcements to defend it. The 101st Airborne Division, veterans of the Normandy Jump and Market Garden operation, were trucked to Bastogne along with elements of other units. By the time German forces surrounded the town on December 20th, approximately 18,000 American soldiers were inside the Bastogne perimeter, along with some armor, artillery, and support troops. They faced German forces that outnumbered them at least 3-1, with more Germans arriving constantly. The Americans defending Bastogne were in a desperate situation. They were completely surrounded with no possibility of resupply by ground. Air resupply was attempted, but was severely limited by bad weather that kept aircraft grounded most days. Ammunition was running low, food was scarce, medical supplies were inadequate for treating the wounded who filled improvised aid stations. The cold was brutal. Made worse by the fact that soldiers couldn't build fires without revealing their positions. German artillery shelled the town constantly. German attacks probed the perimeter looking for weak points. Every day the situation became more critical. American commanders inside Bastogne calculated how long they could hold based on remaining ammunition and food supplies and realized they were running out of time. On December 22, 1944, German commanders decided to offer the Americans at Bastogne an opportunity to surrender. 4 German soldiers approached American lines under a white flag, carrying a formal surrender ultimatum. The document, written in English, acknowledged that American forces were surrounded and cut off from support. It noted that German artillery and air power could destroy the town completely. It offered honorable surrender terms, promising that American prisoners would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The message concluded by warning that if the surrender offer was refused, German forces would annihilate the American garrison. The German officers who delivered this message expected acceptance. By any rational military calculation, the American position was hopeless. Surrounded, outnumbered, low on supplies, facing overwhelming force, the Americans had no reasonable option except surrender. The German officers waited for the reply they assumed would come after brief deliberation. The surrender demand was brought to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division and senior American officer in Bastogne. McAuliffe read the German ultimatum, and his response was immediate and emphatic. When asked what reply should be sent to the Germans, McAuliffe said simply, "Nuts." His staff initially thought he was joking, but McAuliffe was serious. That would be the complete official American reply to the German surrender demand. One word, nuts. When the typed response was delivered to the German officers waiting under flag of truce, they were confused. The word didn't translate clearly into German military terminology. An American officer explained in simple terms what the reply meant. Go to hell. The German officers were shocked. They had expected either acceptance of surrender terms or at least a counter-proposal requesting better terms. Instead, they received contemptuous refusal. They returned to German lines and reported that the Americans, despite their hopeless situation, refused to surrender. German commanders receiving McAuliffe's reply struggled to understand American reasoning. By every military standard, the Bastogne garrison should surrender. They were surrounded, outnumbered, running out of supplies, facing certain destruction if they continued fighting. Surrender was not just reasonable, but virtually obligatory given the circumstances. German military culture valued bravery, but also recognized that futile sacrifice served no purpose. A commander whose forces were clearly defeated had a duty to surrender rather than waste lives in hopeless resistance. But the Americans were refusing to accept military reality. They were choosing to keep fighting, despite knowing they would probably all die or be captured. This stubbornness, this refusal to acknowledge defeat even when defeat was obvious, struck German commanders as irrational. It also struck them as disturbing, because it suggested that American soldiers were not the soft, comfort-seeking troops that German intelligence had described. The weather that had been causing such suffering for troops on both sides suddenly became an American advantage. On December 23rd, the skies cleared for the first time in days. American aircraft, grounded by fog and low clouds since the offensive began, could finally fly. Transport planes immediately began dropping supplies to Bastogne. Parachutes filled the sky as bundles of ammunition, medical supplies, and food descended to the surrounded garrison. Not all supply drops landed inside American lines. Some fell in German-held territory, but enough reached the defenders to ease the most critical shortages. More importantly, American fighter bombers began attacking German forces around Bastogne and throughout the battle area. German columns that had been moving freely in bad weather now found themselves under constant air attack. German supply lines were interdicted. German armor was strafed and bombed. The clear weather that had seemed like a break from the misery of fighting in snow and fog became a nightmare for German forces who had no air cover and who discovered that American air power, once unleashed, was devastating. The fighting around Bastogne intensified as German commanders tried to break through American defenses before relief could arrive. German attacks came from multiple directions, sometimes supported by armor, always accompanied by artillery bombardment. American defenders fought from foxholes and improvised positions, often in hand-to-hand combat when German forces broke through the perimeter. The fighting was brutal and close range, with grenades thrown into positions just yards apart and rifles and machine guns firing at point-blank range. American forces gave ground in some locations but counterattacked to restore their lines. German forces suffered heavy casualties but kept attacking, knowing that if Bastogne could be taken, the entire offensive might still succeed. The battle raged through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, with neither side giving any recognition to the holiday except in pauses when exhausted men rested briefly before resuming combat. American soldiers defending Bastogne endured conditions that tested human limits. They fought from frozen foxholes, eating frozen rations when they could eat at all, watching friends die beside them, treating frostbite that was nearly as debilitating as combat wounds. They were cold all the time, exhausted all the time, scared but refusing to quit. The ones who had been in combat before knew their situation was desperate. The newer soldiers learned quickly that they were probably going to die or be captured unless relief arrived soon. But McAuliffe's defiant reply to the German surrender demand had set a tone. If their commander was refusing to quit, if the general was willing to fight to the end rather than surrender, then the soldiers would do the same. The reply "nuts" became a source of pride and determination, a symbol of American refusal to accept defeat regardless of circumstances. German soldiers attacking Bastogne found themselves increasingly impressed and frustrated by American resistance. They were fighting soldiers who by all logic should have surrendered days ago. Soldiers who were outnumbered and outgunned, but who kept fighting with determination that bordered on fanaticism. German units that had been told Americans were soft, that Americans would break under pressure, were discovering through painful experience that this was not true. The Americans defending Bastogne were not soft. They were tough, resourceful, and absolutely unwilling to quit. German casualties mounted as attacks were thrown back. German soldiers began questioning the intelligence assessments that had promised easy victory over demoralized Americans. These Americans didn't seem demoralized. They seemed angry and determined, and they were killing Germans very effectively despite their disadvantages. General George Patton's Third Army, positioned south of the German offensive, received orders on December 19th to disengage from its current operations, turn 90 degrees north, and attack toward Bastogne to relieve the surrounded garrison. This was an extraordinarily difficult military maneuver. Turning an entire army, approximately 250,000 men, with all their equipment and supplies, 90 degrees in winter conditions, required moving on icy roads through snow, coordinating thousands of vehicles, rerouting supply lines, and attacking into the flank of a major enemy offensive. Most military professionals would have said the maneuver required weeks of preparation and planning. Patton promised Eisenhower he could do it in 3 days and launch his attack on December 22nd. Patton's staff worked around the clock preparing movement orders, coordinating with units, arranging fuel and ammunition supplies. Patton himself drove the effort with his characteristic energy and profanity, demanding the impossible and getting it because his soldiers and staff would do anything to avoid disappointing him. Patton's Third Army began its movement north on December 22nd, exactly as promised. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched through snow and ice. Thousands of vehicles navigated treacherous roads. Artillery units limbered their guns and moved to new positions. Supply convoys rerouted to support the changed direction of operations. The entire massive effort proceeded with efficiency that reflected excellent staff work and soldier discipline. German commanders, when they realized what Patton was doing, were astonished. They had assumed that turning an entire army would take weeks and that Bastogne would fall long before American relief could arrive. The speed with which Patton moved his forces violated German assumptions about what was operationally possible. It demonstrated American organizational capability and flexibility that German military doctrine didn't account for. Patton's forces attacked north through German positions, fighting a series of battles to break through to Bastogne. German forces defending the southern approaches to Bastogne resisted fiercely, knowing that if Patton's forces broke through, the entire German offensive would be jeopardized. The fighting was savage, with both sides taking heavy casualties. Weather remained brutal, with temperatures well below zero and snow making movement difficult for armor and infantry. American forces advanced steadily despite resistance, pushed forward by Patton's relentless drive and by awareness that surrounded Americans at Bastogne were counting on relief. Every hour of delay meant more American casualties in Bastogne, more men freezing or starving or dying from wounds that couldn't be properly treated. Patton's forces pushed harder than seemed humanly possible, attacking through conditions that should have made offensive operations impossible. On December 26th, Advance elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through German defences south of Bastogne and made contact with the Bastogne garrison. The siege was broken. Supplies and reinforcements could now reach the town by ground. Wounded could be evacuated. The crisis had passed. The relief of Bastogne became one of the most celebrated military achievements of the war, validation that American forces could accomplish extraordinary things under pressure. The soldiers who had held Bastogne for 6 days, while surrounded and outnumbered, had proven that American troops could match any soldiers in the world for toughness and determination. McAuliffe's one-word reply, "nuts," entered American military legend as the perfect expression of American fighting spirit. The Battle of the Bulge continued for weeks after Bastogne was relieved, with fighting extending through January 1945 before Allied forces finally eliminated the German salient and restored the front lines. The entire battle cost approximately 19,000 American soldiers killed, approximately 47,000 wounded, and roughly 23,000 captured or missing. Total American casualties exceeded 89,000 men. German casualties were comparable, with estimates ranging from 80,000 to 100,000 killed, wounded, or captured. For both sides, the Battle of the Bulge represented enormous losses in men and equipment. But the strategic outcomes differed dramatically. Germany had gambled its last reserves on the offensive and lost. The panzers, infantry divisions, and supplies committed to the Ardennes offensive were destroyed or depleted and could not be replaced. Hitler's last gamble had failed completely, and Germany had nothing left for defending against the Soviet offensive building in the east or the American and British offensives that would resume in the west. German commanders analyzing what had gone wrong with the offensive identified multiple factors. Weather had been worse than expected, limiting German mobility and eventually allowing American air power to intervene decisively. Logistics had failed, with German armor running out of fuel because supply lines couldn't keep pace with the advance. Allied intelligence had recovered more quickly than expected, with American forces identifying German objectives and rushing reinforcements to critical points. But one factor appeared repeatedly in German after-action assessments. American fighting quality had been far better than intelligence had predicted. Germans had expected that attacking American forces with overwhelming surprise would create panic and collapse. Instead, American units had fought desperate delaying actions that slowed the German advance. Germans had expected surrounded American forces, like those at Bastogne, to surrender quickly. Instead, Americans had held out for nearly a week under impossible conditions and refused all surrender demands. Germans had expected that American soldiers, coming from comfortable backgrounds and lacking battle hardening, would break under the stress of winter combat. Instead, American forces had endured conditions that would have challenged any soldiers and had maintained combat effectiveness despite suffering from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Individual German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes and survived wrote memoirs or gave interviews in later years, and their assessments of American soldiers changed dramatically because of their experience in the battle. German veterans who had dismissed Americans as soft acknowledged that the soldiers they fought in the Ardennes were as tough as any they had faced, including on the brutal Eastern Front. One German soldier wrote that he had pitied American prisoners captured during the offensive because they were shivering from cold and appeared to lack proper winter equipment. But he also noted that despite their suffering, American prisoners showed no signs of broken morale or despair. They were cold and tired, but not defeated psychologically. Another German veteran recalled that his unit attacked the same American position 3 times over 2 days, suffering heavy casualties each time, and the Americans never retreated or showed signs of wavering, despite being outnumbered. The German veteran said that by the 3rd attack, his unit's soldiers were openly saying the Americans were the toughest opponents they had faced in the entire war. The German soldiers' diaries and letters captured during the battle or found after the war revealed the evolution of German attitudes. Early entries, written in the first days of the offensive, when German forces were advancing successfully, expressed confidence and contempt for Americans. The Americans run when we attack. They are not soldiers like us. But later entries, written after days of brutal combat and after the offensive stalled, told a different story. The Americans fight like devils. They will not give up their positions even when surrounded. did, we have underestimated them badly. One diary found on a dead German soldier contained an entry written on December 27th, the day after Bastogne was relieved. We were told the Americans were soft and would not fight in winter. This was a lie. I have fought in Russia and in France, and I say the American soldier is as hard as any I have faced. We cannot win this war if this is what we must fight. American soldiers who survived the Battle of the Bulge carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives, much like veterans of Omaha Beach. The intense cold, the constant fear, the sight of friends freezing to death or dying from wounds, the exhaustion of fighting for days without rest, all of it left marks that never completely faded. Many veterans of the Bulge struggled with cold for the rest of their lives, their bodies remembering those weeks in frozen foxholes and reacting to winter weather with anxiety and discomfort that people who hadn't experienced such extreme cold couldn't understand. Some developed medical problems related to frostbite that plagued them for decades. Others had psychological wounds, nightmares about being cold and surrounded, flashbacks triggered by winter weather. But they also had pride. They had endured what seemed unendurable. They had proven themselves tough under the worst possible conditions. When people questioned whether American soldiers could match European soldiers for hardness and fighting spirit, veterans of the Bulge knew the answer from personal experience. The soldiers who defended Bastogne became particular heroes in American military culture. The 101st Airborne Division earned permanent fame for its stand at Bastogne, and Nuts became forever associated with the division and with American military defiance. General McAuliffe, who had given the famous one-word reply, became a celebrated figure, promoted to Major General and honored for his leadership during the siege. He spent the rest of his life being asked about that moment, about why he replied as he did, about what he was thinking when he refused the German surrender demand. McAuliffe's answer was always simple: surrender never entered his mind as a possibility. His men were fighting, they would continue fighting, and the Germans could go to hell. That attitude, that absolute refusal to even consider surrender, regardless of circumstances, represented something essential about American military culture that European observers had underestimated. The relief of Bastogne by Patton's Third Army became part of Patton's legend, another example of his ability to accomplish the impossible through sheer will and excellent staff work. Patton had promised to reach Bastogne in 3 days, and he had done it, turning an entire army 90 degrees in winter conditions and fighting through German defenses to break the siege. Military historians studying the operation concluded it was one of the most impressive logistical and tactical achievements of the war. The maneuver required coordinating thousands of separate movements, rerouting supplies, changing operational plans on the fly, and maintaining combat effectiveness while repositioning. That Patton's forces accomplished this while fighting in temperatures well below zero made the achievement even more remarkable. German commanders who had expected Bastogne to fall before relief could arrive had miscalculated badly, underestimating both the determination of Bastogne's defenders and the capability of American forces to execute complex operations under adverse conditions. The impact of the Battle of the Bulge on Allied strategy was significant. The German offensive delayed Allied plans for advancing into Germany by several weeks and consumed resources that had been stockpiled for those offensives. But the delay was ultimately minor compared to the damage the battle did to German military capability. Germany had committed its last operational reserves to the Ardennes offensive and had lost them. The panzers that might have defended against Soviet offensives in the east were destroyed in the Ardennes. The infantry divisions that might have held Rhine River defenses were shattered fighting Americans in Belgium. German fuel reserves, already critically low, were largely expended in the failed offensive. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended, Germany had no strategic reserves left, no mobile forces available to respond to Allied attacks, and no resources to rebuild what had been lost. The offensive had been Hitler's last chance to change the war's trajectory, and its failure ensured that Germany's defeat was now just a matter of time. The home front impact in America of the Battle of the Bulge was significant. The offensive was initially portrayed in news reports as a dangerous German attack that threatened Allied positions. This caused anxiety among American families who knew their sons, husbands, and fathers were fighting in Europe and who feared that Germany might still win despite apparent Allied advantages. When news of the Siege of Bastogne reached America, followed by reports of American forces holding out despite being surrounded and outnumbered, the story captured public attention. The nuts reply became famous immediately, reported in newspapers across the country, and celebrated as evidence of American fighting spirit. The relief of Bastogne was front-page news, celebrated as a victory and as proof that American soldiers could match any enemy. The Battle of the Bulge, despite its cost, became a source of national pride rather than concern about setbacks. The winter conditions during the Battle of the Bulge created a shared experience among veterans that bonded them for life. Men who had never met each other, but who had both fought in the Ardennes in December 1944 and January 1945, had an instant connection. They understood what it meant to fight in those conditions, to be that cold, to be that scared, to keep fighting despite wanting nothing more than to find warmth and safety. Veterans organizations that formed after the war often organized around shared combat experiences, and Battle of the Bulge veterans were particularly close-knit. They held reunions, maintained contact, and supported each other through decades after the war. The suffering they had shared created bonds that civilian life could never completely understand, but that veterans recognized in each other immediately. The families of soldiers who died in the Battle of the Bulge faced grief made more painful by the circumstances of the deaths. Learning that a loved one had died from freezing rather than from enemy fire, or had died while surrounded and cut off from help, added elements of suffering to the loss. Parents imagining their sons dying slowly from cold, husbands thinking about wives who had frozen to death in foxholes, the details made grief harder to bear. The casualty notifications that went out to families across America in January 1945 brought devastation to communities already weary from years of war. The hope that the war in Europe was nearly over made these late-war deaths seem particularly tragic, lives lost when victory was so close. The military cemeteries in Belgium, where many Battle of the Bulge casualties are buried, became sites of pilgrimage for families and veterans. The Henri Chapelle American Cemetery and the Ardennes American Cemetery contain thousands of graves of soldiers who died in the battle. The grave markers, arranged in perfect rows on manicured grounds, represent young men who died far from home in conditions of extreme hardship. Many of the buried soldiers were teenagers, 18 or 19 years old, who had been in Europe for just weeks or months before they died. Their graves were visited by parents who had lost sons, by siblings who had lost brothers, by widows who had lost husbands. The Belgian people maintained deep gratitude to the Americans who had liberated them and who had died defending Belgian territory from German reconquest. Belgian families adopted American graves, maintaining them and placing flowers on them decades after the war ended. The contrast between American and German soldier experiences during the Battle of the Bulge revealed important differences in how the two militaries operated. German soldiers, despite having better winter clothing than Americans, suffered terribly from cold because German logistics couldn't adequately supply forces in the field. German soldiers went hungry because supply lines were disrupted and because Germany lacked the resources to feed its military properly. German wounded often couldn't be evacuated because fuel shortages immobilized vehicles and because American air attacks made movement dangerous. German soldiers fought bravely but knew they were fighting for a lost cause, that their sacrifices were delaying rather than preventing defeat. American soldiers, despite worse initial equipment for winter conditions, received continuous supply support once the weather cleared. American wounded were evacuated and received medical care that saved lives. American soldiers knew they were winning the war and that their sacrifices were contributing to victory. The difference in morale and sustaining power between forces fighting for a winning cause versus forces fighting for a lost one became increasingly apparent as the battle progressed. The technological and tactical lessons from the Battle of the Bulge influenced American military thinking for decades afterward. The importance of winter equipment and cold weather training was driven home by the suffering American soldiers experienced. Future American military doctrine emphasized that forces must be prepared for operations in all weather conditions, and that comfort items like proper clothing were not luxuries, but necessities for maintaining combat effectiveness. The value of air power. demonstrated dramatically once weather cleared and American aircraft could fly, reinforced Air Force arguments for resources and priority. The importance of flexible command and rapid response, shown by Patton's ability to turn his entire army in 3 days, became a standard that American commanders were expected to meet. Every aspect of the battle was studied and incorporated into training and doctrine. The Battle of the Bulge also demonstrated the importance of individual initiative and small unit leadership. When American forces were surprised and overwhelmed in the opening days of the offensive, victory or defeat often came down to what individual officers and sergeants did in their immediate areas. Small units that held positions they had not prepared, that fought as coherent forces even when cut off from higher command, that took initiative to counterattack or defend key terrain without orders. These small unit actions collectively prevented German breakthrough that might have succeeded if American forces had simply retreated in disorder. The American military culture that encouraged junior leaders to make decisions and take initiative. The informality that British observers had sometimes criticized as lack of discipline proved valuable when formal command structures broke down under the chaos of surprise attack. The enduring image of American soldiers fighting in the Ardennes, particularly the photograph of soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division trudging through snow during the Siege of Bastogne, became iconic representations of American military service. The soldiers in those photographs looked cold, tired, and determined. They wore whatever winter gear they had been able to scrounge, often inadequate but better than nothing. Their faces showed strain and exhaustion, but they were moving forward, doing their jobs, refusing to quit despite conditions that seemed designed to break human will. Those images contradicted German assumptions about American softness more effectively than any amount of propaganda could have. You could see in those photographs that these were tough men, doing hard things under terrible conditions, and they were doing it because their duty required it. The post-war relationship between German and American veterans of the Battle of the Bulge developed over decades into mutual respect. German veterans who had fought in the Ardennes acknowledged in reunions and interviews that their assumptions about American soldiers had been wrong. They had been told Americans were soft, unprepared for hardship, likely to break under pressure. The battle had taught them otherwise. American veterans, for their part, developed respect for German soldiers who had fought skillfully despite being outnumbered and undersupplied by the battle's end. The shared experience of having fought in that terrible winter created a bond even among former enemies. Veterans from both sides attended commemorative events in Belgium, walked the battlefields together, and shared memories of the fighting. The old hatreds faded with time, replaced by soldiers' respect for others who had done their duty under difficult circumstances. The strategic significance of the Battle of the Bulge extended beyond the immediate military outcome. Hitler's decision to commit Germany's last reserves to an offensive in the West, rather than using them to defend against the massive Soviet offensive building in the East, was a strategic error of enormous magnitude. The forces destroyed in the Ardennes were not available when Soviet forces launched their winter offensive in January 1945. The panzers lost fighting Americans in Belgium might have slowed Soviet advances into Germany. The infantry divisions shattered in the Ardennes might have held defensive positions along the Oder River. Germany's defeat was probably inevitable by late 1944, but Hitler's decision to gamble everything on the Ardennes offensive accelerated the end by eliminating forces that might have prolonged the war for months. In that sense, the Battle of the Bulge shortened the war and saved lives by destroying German military capacity more quickly than continued defensive operations would have. The role of African American soldiers in the Battle of the Bulge deserves specific recognition. The American military in 1944 was still racially segregated, with black soldiers generally relegated to support and service roles rather than combat positions. But the desperate situation during the Battle of the Bulge led to temporary changes. Black soldiers volunteered to serve in combat roles, and some were integrated into previously all-white units. These soldiers fought with distinction during the battle, proving that racial prejudices about black soldiers lacking combat capability were as unfounded as German prejudices about American soldiers being soft. The experience of integrated combat during the Bulge contributed to arguments for desegregating the military, though full integration wouldn't come until President Truman's executive order in 1948. The Christmas aspect of the Battle of the Bulge added poignancy to the suffering. Soldiers on both sides were fighting and dying during a season associated with peace and family. American soldiers received Christmas packages from home containing cookies, letters, and small gifts, reminders of the normalcy and comfort they were missing. Some units managed brief Christmas services, with chaplains conducting services in frozen forests while artillery rumbled in the distance. The famous photograph of American soldiers attending Christmas Eve services in a bombed-out church in Belgium captured the contrast between the holiday's meaning and the reality of war. For soldiers' families back in America, Christmas 1944 was shadowed by knowledge that their loved ones were fighting in desperate conditions and by fear that casualty notifications might arrive, turning the holiday into permanent grief. The linguistic legacy of the Battle of the Bulge includes not just McAuliffe's famous nuts, but also other phrases that entered American military vocabulary. Bastogne became synonymous with determined defense against overwhelming odds. The Bulge became shorthand for any military situation where friendly forces were surrounded or under severe pressure. References to fighting in the Ardennes carried connotations of hardship endured and obstacles overcome. Veterans describing later challenges in their lives sometimes referenced the Bulge as their standard for what constituted real difficulty, with the implication that anything less severe than those frozen weeks in Belgium was manageable by comparison. The generational impact of the Battle of the Bulge shaped how Americans born in the 1920s and 30s viewed themselves and were viewed by later generations. They were the generation that had survived the Depression, fought World War II, and built prosperous post-war America. The Battle of the Bulge represented their toughness, their refusal to quit despite hardship, their willingness to sacrifice for causes larger than themselves. When later generations questioned whether Americans could still show that kind of determination, veterans of the Bulge represented living proof that Americans, when tested, had proven themselves equal to any challenge. The physical and psychological scars they carried were evidence of what they had endured and overcome. The historical debates about the Battle of the Bulge have focused on various what-if scenarios. What if American intelligence had detected German preparations and prevented surprise? What if weather had remained clear, allowing American air power to operate from the battle's beginning? What if Hitler had not divided his forces between multiple objectives and had instead concentrated everything on a single thrust? What if Patton had taken 4 days instead of 3 to reach Bastogne? These counterfactuals are interesting intellectual exercises, but they don't change the fundamental reality that American soldiers, despite being surprised, outnumbered, inadequately equipped for winter conditions, and facing Germany's last major offensive, held their positions and won the battle. The victory was not elegant or cheap, but it was complete and decisive. The medals and recognition given to soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge included numerous Medal of Honor awards, Distinguished Service Crosses, Silver Stars, and Bronze Stars. But most soldiers received no individual recognition beyond campaign ribbons and unit citations. They had done what was expected of them, had fought when ordered to fight, had held positions they were told to hold, and had survived or died anonymously as part of large military formations. The decorations mattered to those who received them, but for most veterans the real recognition came from knowing they had done their duty and from the respect of other soldiers who understood what fighting in those conditions had required. The final accounting of the Battle of the Bulge shows it was the largest and bloodiest battle American forces fought in Europe. More Americans died in the Ardennes than in any other single battle of the European theater. The casualty lists included men from every state, from cities and farms, from every economic background and ethnic heritage. They were Catholics and Protestants and Jews, recent immigrants and descendants of families that had been in America for generations. What united them was that they had been American soldiers in the winter of 1944 to 45, fighting in temperatures that dropped to 20 degrees below zero, proving that being raised in comfort didn't mean they couldn't endure hardship when freedom and duty demanded it. The German soldiers who had called Americans soft, who had assumed that young men from a prosperous nation couldn't match soldiers hardened by years of brutal warfare, learned through painful experience that their assumptions were completely wrong. The Battle of the Bulge didn't just defeat a German offensive, It destroyed forever the myth that Americans were too comfortable, too soft, too undisciplined to be first-class soldiers. The men who fought at Bastogne and across the Ardennes proved that American soldiers could match anyone, anywhere, under any conditions. That legacy, purchased with their suffering and blood in frozen Belgian forests, remains part of American military heritage and national identity decades after the last veteran has passed away.